Henderson was the chairman, and at the time he was appointed by the World Health Organization to go to Geneva and set up a pattern, just like we're talking about now with coronavirus. Identify any of these cases and then go find around them any contacts and saturate them. In other words, you do a vaccination campaign, but you do a vaccination campaign that's targeted on the last cases you found until there are no more cases. And I was the guy in the one area of the world where the last cases were not reached by the World Health Organization because of the Biafran War in Nigeria. So I was in the last smallpox epidemic. And the reason, and I got those pictures and showed them to you the other day. Now the reason for that is that they finally got rid of, the very first time in history, that a disease was eradicated. And why eradicated? Because there was no animal reservoir. And continues to this day to be none. So that the only smallpox virus on planet Earth is in a culture, in a laboratory. This one happened to be in London. When it was loosed, so they had to start all over from zero again. So when we talk about wild virus versus those that are in captivity, meaning that they're in stand. So over at Fort Detrick, you have 2 or 3 organisms by type that do not exist in nature. They're only on the culture, and they have to live inside cells because they're obligate intracellular parasites. So those are the things that they want to destroy so they don't come up again. And there are a number of those, and they're saying you can't use those except as germ warfare, because once again, because we've been separated from them by decades, every one of us is naive. There is no immunity to any of them. That's why they're novel. So what happened is that rinderpest eradication took place just the same way smallpox did. They went around to identify the last ones, and they were in a place in Sudan where I was when I was there. And that's when they saturated the whole vaccination of all of those cattle around, because rinderpest, just like the smallpox, has a pretty easily generated immune response to it. So they had, in 1974, the last case, the last wild case of rinderpest. And so in 1984, they celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the last rinderpest. And I was in London at my alma mater there, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, when they had Henderson come, retired now from the deanship at what is now the Bloomberg, formerly the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And they had him come and hang a plaque, which was, on this spot, we now commemorate 10 years since the last wild case of smallpox had occurred, and that was in 1978. So, in fact, now we've got 2 diseases that are historic. They don't exist. And the agitation is to destroy their seed stock out of their live virus, which is maintained in cells. The next 2 for which they have a possibility, and it's not a very great one, is that they were going to eradicate polio using the very same things. Political problems. One of those political problems being, we are public health people. We have no care and concern about your politics. We don't care about that at all. So we're going to go around and search and then vaccinate heavily all around the last cases we can find. Polio, a very good example, where they identified, and where I was in Africa, there's still posters hanging everywhere. Lower motor neuron paralysis. If you find a child who has lower motor neuron paralysis, which means they are conscious, they have no problems with their central nervous system, but they can't move their extremities, they get wasting muscle disease, we will give you 100 pounds if you bring this to the attention of, 100 pounds is 4 annual salaries. So, of course, you're going to find those cases, and those cases that are brought in are typically something else. And you know about the other kinds of lower motor neuron paralyses, which are largely, kinds of diseases that you hear about associated with non-steroidal Tylenol, things like that. So, what happened? Again, I'm public health. I have no concern about your politics. I'm going to go through the last little vestiges of this place. I'm going to go to remote Pakistan. and I'm going to search around. I'm going to say, is there a child around here with low to moderate polio? What's that building over there with a fenced gate around it? We're just polio researchers, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the hunt for Osama bin Laden, under the guise of a polio surveillance, means no way we're ever going to have any kind of polio vaccination campaign here, thank you very much. Where are the last cases of polio? 29 last year, 2019. There were 29 cases of polio on planet Earth in Pakistan.
Oh my God.
So now we can't knock those off by doing the same saturation thing, because there's a distrust in the people that you didn't come over here to conquer polio, did you? So that's even legitimate on their side as opposed to ours. Number one, polio. As I said, number one was smallpox. Number two, rinderpest, and they're gone. So now number one that's remaining is polio. Number two that's remaining of the four that are the likely ones to get eradicated in human history. And that one is called dracuntiasis, a special one close to my heart. And that's Dracunculus medinensis, is this worm that infiltrates guinea worm. Okay, so the reason for that is it too has no other host. The other host is a small crustacean, and that is the one in which it the eggs are hatched, and what happens then as it comes out is a little miracidium, and it penetrates the skin when the women are going down to draw water. And so that cycle. So they've been doing things like the life straw to filter out the miracidia. They're doing a lot of other things. So in South Sudan right now, the posters are up. Have you seen this little thing coming out? If you have 100 pounds. So once again, they're going to identify all of those, and they put them in a camp just as sterilized as a multiple drug resistant TB, isolate them, and no one is allowed to be there, and they keep it going until there's no. So the Carter Foundation is the one that's trying to do that one right now. But the fact is, can you believe it? And I sound like I've just made this up. 29 cases. Turns out by coincidence to be exactly the same as the polio last year of dracunculus.
I'll be damned.
Last year. So now that's going to go before polio does, because of the lesser political interference. So now what happens about these 4 diseases that have been eradicated? That means we will never in human history ever encounter them again because they are gone. Well, once again, we now have a totally naive population. What if one of those measles, morbillivirus, mutates to become the new rinderpest? The vulnerability of a monoculture. Now, it goes just like the coronavirus did here. And that is, it goes through the population because there's no... Now, make it really clear, there is no treatment for smallpox. There is no treatment for polio. There is no treatment for the rinderpest, and there's no treatment for cyclops. These are all containment and trying to do something about letting them fall by their own weight. There's no treatment. Now, let me say this, and I said it to Jim. There is no therapy of coronavirus. If there were, I wouldn't be having colds every other year and sniffles. There is no treatment of the coronavirus disease. So, as I said to Jim, I'm not the president, and I don't even play one on TV. No to hydroxychloroquine. I happen to know a lot about that drug for other reasons, right? Because the cinchonas and all of them are familiar to me for the malaria treatment. No, I don't spray Clorox into the lungs and don't put an ultraviolet down there.
Oh
no,
my God,
let's just forget it. There is no treatment for the disease. Now, here comes the next question, which is even more fascinating, and this is the subject of the Grand Rounds I'll give a little bit later. And this comes from my friend Dennis Burkett, who would be known to you perhaps from other reasons. And he was a good Irishman who went to the Medical Research Council and worked in Uganda, in Makere, in Kampala. Makere University, a very good place there. And he was a surgeon, although not a trained surgeon. And I became one of his colleagues, and we wrote a paper or two together. I'll give you his challenge. Name for me a disease, any disease, for which improvements in diagnosis or treatment decreased the incidence.
Oh, boy.
We'll give you a certain 90 seconds of timing there before we'll tell you the answer to that, and that is, there is none. There is no disease on planet Earth for which an improvement in diagnosis or treatment decreased the incidence of the disease. Now, as I said to Jim earlier, when we were talking about this, all over my buildings and the sidewalks around George Washington University, very active group with a whole lot of political pressures, said, "ACT UP is watching you. We demand an AIDS vaccine." And my answer to that would have been, we have penicillin, therefore there is no gonorrhea. The answer is, for every disease for which you get a very effective treatment, it tolls the reasons to live wisely. In other words, if I had a treatment for, and then you name whatever it might be, I get a better and better treatment, there are more and more people with that disease.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, they survive. Secondly, it gives them no reason to change their behavior. So let's say that right now, you notice all through the United States, we're getting better and better at diagnosing and treating diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, jolly well better, because every year there are many, many more people with diabetes. And I don't mean the population increases and the diabetic population increases. No. It's out of proportion that many more of the population has that every year. So that there are these metabolic diseases that seem to accumulate with better treatment. And this is another example, and I don't like the example of people who misuse the language, but preventative. I said, is it preventive?
Preventative medicine.
Is it preventive quite good enough? I mean, I'll take that.
Yeah, right.
One less syllable. Nonetheless, we are undertaking a preventative program for breast cancer.
Having just taken this course, where are we going with this?
Well, this is the point, that if you say, I want a vaccine, what that might do is it might take out of your purview the etiologic agent. But if the niche remains open, something else will fall into it. There's something will, of course, not be treatable, because it'll be a big surprise to you, because you already have a control measure for that. Example, a poor woman out there in Kenya, out in Marsabit, where I am in the Great Rift Valley, comes to Kibera, the slum in Nairobi, as a commercial sex worker. It's a more elevated name, I guess, now. Of course she's going to get a communicable disease. Of course it's going to be one you can't treat. So it was a hotbed culture plate of AIDS. HIV fell into that. Now let's assume we have an AIDS vaccine, which is not probable. Don't even calculate that, because think of all the investment that's been made already and didn't work very well. Back to that in a moment when we talk about even more complex organisms against which it is. Nonetheless, assume we have that, and boom, she isn't going to get HIV. Well, no, she'll get hepatitis. No, she'll get green monkey virus. No, she'll have monkeypox. She'll have something for which we don't have, because the niche is still there. So now coronavirus comes in. If you notice, a lot of people are dying. Well, strangely enough, it seems everyone's now discovered for the very first time, the people dying are people who are sick before but didn't have mortality from their disease. They have morbidity. They have diabetes, they're obese, they're hypertensive, they've had strokes, and they have a lot of kidney failure, asthma, hypercholesterolemia. And now along comes the coronavirus, and those are the people on ventilators, and those are the people who don't survive the disease. So you've got a niche. So come up with a coronavirus vaccine. Poof, coronavirus is history. We don't have it anymore.
You know what this course has just told me?
What's that?
The smaller the niche, the more popular you're going to be.
Exactly that, because you don't get credit for a disease that didn't happen, because no one even can recognize it.
Right.
So as a consequence, they're going to say, we know the name of the guy who knocked off whatever disease it is. The fact is, if you say, We encourage you to live wisely and to avoid the following degenerative disorders. Huh? Does that mean I have to get off the couch? Come on, flake off. I want a cure. The only time in my life I've ever written a letter to a celebrity was I saw a TV interview. I don't watch TV that much, so it must have been a rare shot when I did. I think I was in a hotel going someplace with Larry Hagman.
Oh, yeah, right.
Star of Dallas. And he said, I've had a pretty good life. It's been good. Of course, I blew out my liver, but I got a new one. And now it's going a little bad. And hey, I have a brighter day tomorrow to look forward to because I'm going to get me another. And I wrote a letter. I don't usually do that to celebrities, but I said, you bastard. Did you think that grew on a tree? Someone died in order that we are constantly mitigating chronic disease that is directly relevant to your habits and your lifestyle. So no, I don't think we ought to be sacrificing this for a child with a congenital liver failure and gives you the liver that could save that child's life when you're going to blow out the third liver or the fourth. And how many times do you think we can do this? Because you say, look what we can do today to cure this problem. Well, if that we is me, I'm off that bus. Sorry, guys, because I'm not sure I can do a second or third liver transplant, number one. Number two, what kind of resources are we dealing with? Are these something we can mass produce? So that's the story about ventilators. And the ventilator is, it's necessary. These people are dying. They're suffocating. They're dying. Yeah, it's necessary. Is it also sufficient? We've just got 190,000 new ventilators on top of the 190,000 that exist in the U.S. And there are maybe 20 people per town that know anything about how to use one. And do you think those are generated like that? Yeah. Call up General Motors. I'd like to have another 190,000 specialists that are intensivists who know how to use that ventilator. Not likely. And then the next is, does it work? No, wait a minute. We need to put a tube in somebody and keep them. I'm in Africa. They want me to go. This was the big discussion on Mission Heal. We want you to go and intubate all these people and start them on intensive care. I can't get them to care, let alone intensive care. And is there a hospital bed, like an inpatient bed, let alone an ICU? And secondly, once I put that tube in there, I have to hook them to a ventilator. Is there one there? Well, if there isn't, get one. Make one. Okay, make one now. Now, where's the intensive care nurse? First of all, there's no night nursing, even if there were an inpatient bed.
Yeah.
And so in the Chinese proverb, are you saved this life? So 24/7, you own it. So in other words, I've taken on this burden by starting on that process. So now I'm here at George Washington University. Next door, I've got Georgetown University. And I have good friends from the mission in Georgetown who are reporting to me daily. What's the census? Who's sick? Who's in the ICU? Who's on a ventilator? And now here's the kicker. How many of those come off? It was necessary to get intubation. It was necessary to have a ventilator. Well, why was that necessary for them when it wasn't for these other people? Well, they had hypertension and diabetes and they were cirrhotic and so therefore had a bit of liver failure. And by the way, strangely enough, we now got an explosion in the number of people we have to dialyze because they all have kidney failure. Kidney failure, where'd that come from? Well, it was one of those things they were predisposed to before the coronavirus, but now with all this other complex that we got, so now we got to dialyze a whole lot of these people. In other words, we have takeover for all their failing organ systems against those reserves that they'd already borrowed. There are no reserves. So with the lungs failing, the kidneys couldn't help out, the heart couldn't take over. Well, ordinarily, if I can't breathe very well, my heart takes up the difference. That's called compensation. Now, if that didn't work very well, the kidneys can take care of some of that acid burden. And they can, no, if the kidneys don't work, so that is called decompensation. So when you borrow the reserves out of these organ systems, of course they're going to fail. So the majority of the people, here I'll say it right out loud and people will now come to me and say, what kind of foolishness is this? The majority of the people who go on a ventilator don't come off alive.
Jim, can I interrupt?
Sure.
At one time, I would have said, look, we've got to compress this and make it simpler so people understand. But you know what this program was saying with this Max Tucker, who is incredibly knowledgeable and has really hit some the bestseller list. All this adds to building up the belief and the knowledge and the trust in the person talking and showing that they really know what they're talking about, as opposed to all the other people who are talking opinions. And so I'd say we've got to get a podcast that puts out this data as well. And don't change a thing. Keep going, because you're establishing your expertise, and then people will trust what you're saying.
Well, the one person you don't want to listen to is someone who has the answer. I have the answer. Gentlemen, what is the question?
Ooh, that hurts at times.
The question isn't, hey, now look, we got to have the cure, because for every, as you used to say, one ill, one bill, one pill, none of that pertains to this fairly complex issue of how does one survive in a mixed polymicrobial flora who are all commensals until one of them has a particular edge. We can call that a little bit of a drift, a little antigenic drift. For example, next year I might get a new coronavirus because I don't even know if the antibody I have that blocked the last cold I got is active against this next one. Or it can be an antigen shift. There can be a primary thing that comes out of the RNA there that's going to make this thing different, to which none of us, we have 7.8 billion susceptibles now. So the question isn't that. The question is, how do we live in this environment in such a way as to live healthy lives? Not, wait a minute, I didn't even know about this and don't want to know about it, and I can ignore it all until something happens. Now you fix it! I need a fix. So I'm focused on the cure. There are 3 orders of prevention, and I said that, not prevention. Prevention involves not having the disease in the first place. Number 2 involves finding the disease early and fixing it at its earliest stage. And the third is you've got the disease and all the consequences. What can we do to mitigate it? Everyone's working at it from the back end, because thereby I can get known. I have transplanted a liver for someone who blew away theirs. I have gotten a cure for coronary artery disease by replumbing it. I've done something like that. That's mitigation, and it's not really prevention. It may be prevention of morbidity, may even save a few lives, but it's a pretty expensive approach, the back end forward. Second is early diagnosis and treatment. We've now got spectacular new minimally invasive ways to find various tumors and things like breast cancer. We can now use mammography, we can use thermography, we can use CT, we can use MRI, we can use isotopic scans. Isn't it wonderful that we have this very good method of diagnosing when every year another 25,000 women need this in the United States? There are 170,000 already in the incidence, and every year we get better at diagnosing it. There are another 25,000, 30,000 people who need it. Next year there'll be 200,000. After that, it'll be sort of like looking at this great incidence that we're calling an incidence, which is essentially uncovering the prevalence. Now, isn't there something we ought to do primary prevention? What is it that's causing this? Well, we can't find that. I mean, that's an act of God. What do we call it? Force majeure, I think we say this, okay? It's a force majeure. We don't know why you have cancer. Well, let's find out. And I can't be sure all the time because it might take 20 years or maybe a couple of generations to find out what it is in there. But we know a few things, and those few things are not taken out of the environment or they're not modified in our behaviors. Well, there you go again, behavior mod. I'm not into that kind of, I'm not responsible for my health. You are. You're the guy with the degree. And if I were to say to people in the coronary artery business, I'd say, yeah, we can do this operation. It's going to cost $120,000 hospitalization, and we can replumb your arteries, and we can put you on various statins and drugs and things like that. Here is $110. Go buy yourself a set of Nikes. Now, which has done more to primarily prevent the number one cause of death in the United States?
Yeah.
And so that we have had a decrease right now in coronary deaths. And why is that? Is it because we've replumbed everybody's arteries by now? No, it's probable that eventually people realized that was all halfway technology. And yeah, it may have saved a few lives, but the morbidity was largely decreased by behavior modification. One of those was diets. We're not into saturated fats, and those people who are always on statins and things. Second is we've got to modify our, but now cancer, there's nothing you can do to modify your life. Well, wait a minute, let's look at that. And there are primary prevention causes. There are lots of things there. Not all, and I don't know enough to prevent all cancers, but I know that living wisely is a more effective and certainly cheaper strategy. Now, to tell me that it's incomplete or inconclusive, yeah, I agree with that up front. But does that mean we don't usually know? So the whole process of health, I'm a surgeon, remember? I'm the guy who cuts and sews and stitches. I'm the one on the number 3 part of that mitigation list. But we know that what we are doing is shuffling those morbidities. And every time we do that, we have to borrow against the reserves.
Oh, I'm dying to ask this next question.
Go to it.
Let's imagine a month from now, and we see the death rate from this virus dropping,
Right,
and we decide to come out of it.
right.
Would not at that point it be sensible to say, look, the people that are at risk of dying, who are, as you described, the obese, those suffering from other underlying medical problems, let's say we say, look, rather than expose them later on to this virus, why don't we say, look, you people should be kept almost separate and say, yeah, we'll still keep you locked up, if you like, in your homes to try and prevent your being exposed to this. But the rest of the population, without the risk of death, why would we want to continue the lockup? And then, looking further down the road, is there some way they can be treated or helped so that the underlying medical issues can be solved longer term? And don't we end up with a healthier nation anyway? And that's good?
By all means, you've said it. And one of the things you don't preach in the emergency room is, you really should have worn a seatbelt. One of the things you say that I find not only fatuous, but also a bit of an insult. If only you were healthier, you wouldn't be so sick right now.
Yeah, I suppose.
Neither of those are very helpful. So remember,
Yeah.
I'm a therapist. I
Yeah.
have to cure folks. I have to treat
Yeah.
folks. I have to do what's
Yeah.
the problem at hand. This is not the moot point. Now, the answer to your question is, what about you and me? We are the susceptibles, right? We are told that we are the
Yeah,
people at
right.
highest risk.
Right.
And why don't we get some sort of exposure, just enough to immunize us? Well, now that means there's a dose response to this coronavirus, and we don't know that. Number 2,
Right.
we don't know that the exposure is going to generate within you or me an immune response. Number 3, we don't know whether that immune response is going to be protective or just a marker. After all, it didn't work for the coronavirus that gave me the sniffles.
Good point.
And so as a consequence, I would have to say, how to deal in sustained ambiguity is where I live. What do you do with the unknown? You try to act wisely. Now, the wisest thing is not always the quickest. And one of the things that I learned a bit in flight training, when you get lots of red lights going off all of a sudden, don't do something, because there is no problem you can't make considerably worse. So immediately I have the answer to this is
Mhm.
those people are invariably wrong. It has to be a bit more nuanced than that. Now remember again, I'm a surgeon. There's a very much more direct relationship to such things as injury and trauma and the kinds of problems that we have that you can see, well, can't we do this? Remember, we have no magic wand. Every one of these things has a toxicity and a cost associated with it. So that, for example, you've got a problem and it's obvious, well, let me just take that out, means you have to undergo immobilization, which is a big threat to any one of us who might have thrombosis and pneumonia and other things being put at inactive rest. Number two, the risk of anesthesia, the risk of transmission of disease, either from the atmosphere or from blood or whatever comes. All of these things are calculated risks. We can't say that you have a zero risk going into any one of these treatments, and that includes the drug. Now, I've packed away a lot of chloroquine in my days, and I can assure you that if it were the treatment, let's have at it. But since there is no treatment, and to assume that there might be, do you want to buy the risks? So that if you have, for example, give me this as a perfectly good statement, and you would tell me this. People who come into a hospital and have an operation sometimes get infections. And infections cost lives, they cost a lot of money and time and hospitalization rates, and they cost a lot of complications, a lot of morbidity that may follow. All of those are true statements in our premise, let's say yes.
Yes.
I can eradicate that right now. Boom! I have a magic drug, and the magic drug prevents you from ever getting an infection. There are no such, but let's assume that for the moment there are. Let's assume that at least one of them. So you have a 5% risk of having a post-operative infection in a clean elective operation. Assume that. And that this drug will reduce that to 2.5%. But it does that at a 10% toxicity.
Well, it depends what it is.
Well, we're talking about a magic drug now, so we can make it whatever you like, put the sliding scale wherever you wish to have it. But I will point out that that's no favor to anybody who got it. And the reason is 2.5% are going to be infected whether or not the drug is given. 95% never would be infected whether or not the drug was given. And the only benefit came to the decrement in 2.5% who seemed not to get the infection when the drug was given. But against that 10% toxicity, that's no favor to anybody who got it. The same holds true for some of the programs that we just talked about, vaccines. For example, what is this whole population of children that are running around coronavirus positive and don't know it? Are they going to be immune to the disease later? If not this disease, to another one. If it goes through a shift or a drift, is there a next virus? Remember, we're already finding fragments of this virus that look like it's matured from time to time. We have to wait for the maturation of the pathogen. We have to get better in terms of the population. Now look what's happened with the early days of the New World exploration. Columbus came, they found these people, and they were all healthy, and they're running around doing their things, and well, they weren't all healthy because they immediately got sick from smallpox and tuberculosis, which we seem to carry too. But the other part of that exchange, the Columbian exchange, is we brought back to Europe a treponeme. The treponeme went through Europe like plague, and it just knocked off everybody, and it was virulent. And everybody had the pox. They all named it after some of their enemies. It was the Neapolitan pox, or it was the French pox. It seems like since Naples and France were at war at the time, there was a wall there, and so on either side of the wall it had a different name, but there was a lot of, shall we say, fraternization underneath that wall that seemed to exchange that back and forth. So what happened is that the pox, and we wrote about Benvenuto Cellini and his role in become a victim of this pox. The pox went through Europe, and over time it went from a lethal disease to a really badly disfiguring disease to all kinds of things that could cause your aorta to balloon up and eventually burst. It caused you to go insane, called the general paralysis of the insane. There was primary Louis, which was the chancre. Secondary Louis, the rash on the palms and the very unusual soles. And tertiary Louis, central nervous system.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Over time, the treponeme and the human got to cohabit a little better. And why? It's a stupid parasite that kills its host. It's not a very good strategy for long-term survival of the parasite. It's got to come to some sort of accommodation. And so over time, syphilis became an almost chronic, still a disease, but not a lethal disease. And so it went from mortality that was very high to a morbidity, which was modified. And now with our better treatments, we have an ability to make it almost acute disease that comes and goes. But we haven't completely conquered it. It hasn't been eradicated. So the arrogant statement of a lot of people, are, especially political programs, are the conquest of disease. When I was at the National Cancer Institute during the Nixon administration of Congress, and the president would offer a budget for NCI, and the Congress would double it. And the reason was this was the year of the conquest of cancer. Well, now, I know that cancer, having worked with it a fair amount, is not a monolith disease. There's lots of different pieces to it. There's lots of other, no, but that's number one. It comes from our infectious disease bias. We're going to conquer this disease. So that means to say that I am going to stomp out disease is, number one, rather arrogant. Number two, rather ignorant. There are no two combinations on earth that can give you more danger than arrogance and ignorance. So what we must ask is something. I'll give you a quote from Sir William Osler. That's a good thing because he was one of the great four horsemen of the Johns Hopkins founding. And he said, sounds Kennedy-esque, but I assure you Osler got there before Kennedy did. Ask not what kind of disease this patient has. Ask what kind of patient has this disease. And the reason for that is in coronavirus.
Wow, I didn't know about that piece of history.
So here it is. Coronavirus has fallen into a ripe soil. This is a good petri dish. We have a dislocation of a number of people around the globe. We've never had more refugees on planet Earth. And where are the people that are having big troubles? Well, Syria and Iran and a couple other spots like that. And now what's going to happen to my home places, in Africa? Well, there's not going to be a lot of people on ventilators. For one thing, they don't have them. Number two, this is in the University of Michigan, where I had come from in the School of Public Health, invented this term, and everyone uses it as though they know what it means. Flatten the curve.
Yeah.
What that means is lengthen the curve. You're going to put it out. So don't tell me we're going to flatten the curve by May 1. Come on now. We're talking about flattening the curve over the next several years, maybe decades. If you have a very sharp rising curve, the whole pandemic is over sooner. You may not like what it looks like afterwards because all those susceptibles will be dying off. As a consequence, you have an enormous loss of life. Right now, we have 60,000 deaths in the U.S. That's 1/10 of what we had from the 1918 flu that was inappropriately attributed to Spain. And that was 0.6% of the 100 million on Earth that died from that flu. So as a consequence, we have a fairly narrow view of this and say, look, we want to solve this problem. Now, let me give you another. And this is a quote that comes from a fellow who is the founder of anatomic pathology. He was a very wise man, and in fact had a larger view of things. And he, like you, was into history and the economics and the civilization about what is it that we are dealing with. So he was the originator of anatomic pathology. Look at what you see, observe what you have, describe it carefully, and maybe you can interpret it, but maybe it's not up to you. Someone else will later find out what this is and put it in a pattern recognition. His pattern was this. He said, whenever mass disease occurs, it is a result of a disturbance in human culture. Now, as you think about that for 1 minute, I'll give you a couple of examples and then also a corollary or two. That is, if you knock off the agent and the niche remains open, something else will fall in that niche. It will always be untreatable because, after all, if we have a treatment, we try to eradicate it. That commercial sex worker that came to Kibera in the slum. I mean, isn't that a fundamental disruption in human culture? The fellow down in 23rd Street in Washington, D.C. right now who's saying, forget all you people out there, and he's putting a hard drug into his fundamental antisocial act. It doesn't matter if you have an AIDS vaccine. It doesn't matter if you have control of hepatitis. You will now get monkeypox. You will get something to fill that niche because you've had a fundamental disruption of human culture. And when the Mongols came over, they came ripping through a very stable Europe. It was stable the way our 13 colonies were stable.
Yeah.
You had a feudal system where there was a poor guy out there in the field toiling away as a serf, and then, what's with this thing? It's a terrible plague. There is no shield of fortune or of power. It happens to all of us. And so, how many times have you heard this? And I'm sick of it, and I don't want to listen to it on radio yet. We are all in this together. What you mean we? And who are we? Because I can assure you that I just came out of Uganda, I was before that in all parts of Central Africa, and there are a lot of we's. And we don't identify with some of those we's because we don't exchange with them what their basic living is right now. So now, if you have slavery, if you have the mass translocation of people, the biggest thing that ever happened in the history of Africa was the transportation of human beings. And what did that do? There were isolated little endemias. There was sleeping sickness here. There was a particular kind of treponeme that was called yaws. In South America it's called pinta. And we had slavery. These people with yokes and chains, and they had carrying a tusk of ivory, and they were dragged through these endemias. We contaminated this insect. I mean, the simulium fly got the treponeme, got the trypanosome when we brought it through that area. These areas didn't have sleeping sickness before. Now they have trypanosomiasis, which is from contamination we did of that area by dragging humans that were adapted to it in one spot and came along. Hey, what about the United States? Should we talk about the history? And I said, well, no, we know all about the history. And I said, we had a great leader named George Washington. In addition to that, we had a guy who wasn't very good, and his name was Cornwallis. And what happened is that
I remember Cornwallis.
Okay, so now we've got it made because George Washington is running all around New England and New York, and he's being. Why doesn't he stand and fight? Why does he crawl behind these walls? And why is he taking refuge in the woods? Why is he a sniper? Why is he a guerrilla action? Stand up there with your red uniform, your white cross-controlled plume, and 8 feet tall. Why don't you do that? Because these are Prussian tactics, and this is going to mash your firepower. Well, he didn't have the strength to do that. So as they come down to the south, okay, now, look, we're going to beat them in the south. We can beat them in the south. And how are we going to do that?
we forget, Cornwallis had 9,000 men. That was it.
9,000 men. He came in and 9,000 men. How many of those were fighting? In one short month, he had 6,000 men because 1/3 were sick or dying. And the reason was he was attacking the colonists who had lived here for a couple of generations and had the relative immunity to the malaria that dropped his people like flies.
God,
So let's say the biggest arsenal that we had, our secret weapon, our super weapon, was called Anopheles.
And the mosquito.
So that our best super weapon was a mosquito. And so Cornwallis, as he said, I have the mortification to report that it is necessary for me to surrender because 1/3 of my men are now capable of fighting. I have 3,000 men in arms. The others are either buried or they're sick. And the reason for that is there is a partial immunity if you survive malaria. Thank you. I can tell you very sincerely from this experience. If you survive malaria, you have a relative immunity to the lethal form. You can get morbidity, you can get recurrence of malaria. Once again, let me point that out because this is a statement that I made at the time the World Health Organization made this, which I was just a pop. 1968, they said, and a promise came from the World Health Organization, at the same time that they decided they were going to eliminate several diseases from planet Earth. One was smallpox. That's when Henderson got moved to Geneva. That's 10 years later. They got a corner on the surveillance. 10 years after that, they track down the last cases, and I told you 10 years later, he goes to the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, puts up a plaque that it's been 10 years since there's a wild case of smallpox. Great idea. Okay, now, how about that malaria that we promised in 1968? They promised, the World Health Organization said, we are going to relegate to history this disease because we are going to conquer malaria. They did not conquer malaria. They did not eradicate malaria. They eradicated malariologists. As a young investigator, are you going to take up the study of malaria when you know it's going to be obsolete next year? Am I going to get a PhD by working in a lab, as I already did, trying to sex the female Anopheles mosquito and trying to decide which of the malaria species? I mean, I did all of that, but that wasn't a sort of thing I wanted to pursue for another 30 years if next month malaria was going to be history. There has not been a malaria vaccine, and it's unlikely that there will be, because this is not a virus. This is not a tiny particle. This is a complex protozoan organism. Plasmodium falciparum is not a small thing, and it can keep ahead of the FDA. It can mutate faster than anything that we know. So what is a consequence? No, it's already beaten chloroquine. It already beat all the other, so now we have to have newer and better ones. And every time we have a newer and better one, the organism makes a little end run around it because there are a lot more of them than there are of us. We only have 7.8 representatives, 7.8 billion representatives on the planet. 1 gram of the dry weight of enteric contents has 7.8 billion organisms. Each one of them has a little bit different variety of their genome, and only when you put the pressure on them, and one of those happens to be a resistance factor of some kind, being plasmid borne or being nuclear, they are going to survive and come back to get us. And the reason for that is what's the multiplier effect? 7.8 billion humans and 7.8 billion per gram. I would say that the odds aren't very good. So the conquest of disease is both arrogant and ignorant. Second is we can manage, we can control, and much of that has been curative. Curative means we are going to cure you of your coronary artery disease by bypassing it. The less of it is with respect to the idea of trying to prevent that, and preventing it totally by understanding what the etiology is and getting rid of that.
You know, funnily enough, when looking for answers of how we come out of all this, we look at the economics and you say, yes, okay, there's a cost to life and preserving it, and God knows this one is humongous. Even though we go over 50,000 dead, the cost is just incredible because we've shut down the whole world, really, at this point.
Indeed.
And so I said to myself, well, let's look at history, see what happened. Well, it's not a very good comparison because we didn't have medicine of any type, really, to speak of.
Well, then tell me what medicine we have for these primary problems now.
Well, we have none today.
Correct.
So, at any rate, obviously the one that jumps out was the plague.
Yes.
And God knows, I remember as a kid seeing gravestones of actually very close to Edinburgh was the very fast death, the last death in the UK. The gravestone was there, and it says right on the gravestone is the last death in the UK from the plague.
Have you seen the physicians of that era? Have you seen their portraits, and have you seen what they look like?
Yeah.
Now we have this very wide-brimmed leather hat, and we have a mask, and a face cover, and a beak.
And a beak.
And you have the gloves, and what are these? And they're carrying a stick in one hand, not quite 6 feet, but at least enough to keep social distancing. Yeah. And in this hand, they have a thing that's smoldering to give the smoke. Effluvium. We keep the rooms and the miasmas away. But this is the one that I like best. And why is that? Because we put in there, and I'll give you the name. The name comes right out of history. The nosegays. Oh! These are herbs and spices and floral petals in order to keep the unwashed, the effluvium of all you dirty people. And what does this mean? This is PPE, personal protective equipment.
Oh, yeah.
And what are we complaining about today? We got to have people sewing masks at home. We got to have more of the people that have got the goggles. Here's the other part of that is, why would you, if you were part of that public, if you were a surf on a fireman, dying and knew that there was no treatment, and there was no treatment, and this guy wasn't going to help you, and he's just going to isolate you somewhere to bury you when you really want to be with your family, why would you not look at that fellow and call him a quack?
Yeah, lovely. I remember that one.
And what
Anyway,
about the child? The child is going to say, I've got a little nursery rhyme and I'm going to sing it. We're going to dance in a circle and we're going to say, ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. Ash toot, we all fall down.
Oh, lovely.
What does it mean? I mean, you just got it,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Everything about it.
Yeah.
Why do we have the memory of the Pied Piper who was hired by the town council?
Of Hamlin. Yeah, right.
The town council in Hamlin tried to have the piper lead
Yeah.
the rats out of the house.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, it was pretty effective too, because there were rats dead in the street.
And I've been in Hamlin.
Anyway, I hope the rats aren't dead,
Yeah.
but let me say, the rat fall always preceded the smallpox epidemic.
Anyway, going past the plague, the thing that jumps out is the fact that we ran smack into the Renaissance, one of the greatest times of civilization.
Not a coincidence.
It wasn't a coincidence. And I figured out that really what was happening to the economics of that time was that with, I don't know what percent of the world had died during the plague.
40% of the Europe and Middle East, not so much on the outside.
Okay. What happened was that suddenly the people who were left with bigger farms, which it was vital in those days. Well, they still are.
And a fair amount of disruption of the feudal economy in terms of the stratification.
All the people with skills suddenly had, hey, bigger demand, worked harder, worked more. And it wasn't any coincidence. This was the period of all those wonderful cathedrals and other buildings.
And played columns to say to the unknown God that might have helped me through this, yes?
I mean, the world came out in pretty damn good shape.
Is that why the Dow Jones has gone up the last 3 days in a row?
I don't think they were anticipating a world death rate like that. But they were certainly talking about 1-2%.
Mm-hmm.
But I started to say, oh my God, maybe, I don't know what history will say about this period of time, but I keep saying to myself, I wonder if we've overreacted. And if so, oh God, can you imagine the blame game in a political year in
It's
this
there
country?
already, yes.
Oh God.
Now, is it of concern to you that the politicians are the ones doing the public health and medical
Oh, it
decisions?
should never have been in their hands.
And if that's the case, I agree with you that it is a social and a cultural thing.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure I would have them as the leaders of that either, but the fact is that what it really means is that this is not a very good top-down phenomenon.
No, it isn't. No.
As a consequence, what we're talking about is that culture that Virchow saw out there.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, he was in Vienna, for heaven's sakes. This was the place. He ran for mayor, by the way.
Did he?
And he was a mayor. And he
Oh,
was
God.
elected. And as a consequence, he's saying, I want to get into the denominator of what's going on here. Not just the numerator data, how many people are sick and what kind of sickness they have. Well, how did this arise in this culture going on? So that, remember, the medicine is considered an unmitigated good when you need it. It's a pure sea anchor otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
It inhibits education, for heaven's sakes. Do you know a university with any student on campus right now? It inhibits industry. Of course, there's nobody in a factory at all, not even in the meatpacking business, which is considered important and essential, no more. And all of this means that the disruption that we had of our culture became, as almost all of them do, medicalized. We say there's a medical problem, let's fix that. We don't have to talk about living wage for these kids. I mean, why did this happen and why did tuberculosis decimate the Charles Dickens year, when you had sweatshops where people were working 18 hours a day in crowded tenements and they all got tuberculosis. Why? Well, the Mycobacterium tuberculosis is a really bad thing. We should eradicate it. Well, I live with Mycobacterium on a regular basis, and it has been eradicated. And in fact, I seem to have accommodated it quite well. That is, I haven't used PPE to the extent that you see running around today for the virus, and I haven't contracted that disease. And there's probable reason for that. That has to do with nutrition and exercise and other health measures that are not the same in terms of susceptibility. So what happens is that the markers of our failures come with the names of the invaders. This is all the fault of coronavirus. It's those nasty Wuhan Chinese. And now there's a lot of evidence that it came out of Europe because they were here, that genome seemed to get here before, in New York, for example.
Oh, you're kidding.
And now there's even better evidence that when the Chinese variety came to Washington State, there already were cases in California that had died, and now the archival materials have identified them as coronavirus. In essence, it sounds like everyone wants to say it's a point fixation, started right here, and it went everywhere. Whoever's there should have been shot on the spot, like Duterte is saying about the Philippines that are coming out. The fact is, how do you protect yourself when the niches are all open? And it doesn't matter that it's coronavirus. What's to say it can't be this morbillivirus? What's to say it can't be HIV, retrovirus, which is harder to manage because now you've got, remember, there's no treatment for HIV either. The treatment for HIV happens to be a lifelong suppression mitigation method. But at each one of these points, we haven't eradicated HIV. That AIDS vaccine that ACT UP is demanding, or whatever group it was, hasn't happened. There is no malaria vaccine.
Boy, we've got a challenge, Dr. G. How do we get, we owe it to his history to record the right story. And when I say the right story, God, that's a bad statement.
Well, it's the story that we see as we see it, subject to change with corrections from further information.
With corrections.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And I don't know any way to say anything. I do not speak the truth from my ex-cathedra here.
Well, we all have our biases,
And
right?
we will carry those biases probably to our graves unless we can be open-minded enough.
A better word, the limits of our knowledge.
I said of my ancestors who came to this new world 5 generations ago, they had many strong convictions.
Yeah, right.
I will say also that I share some of those convictions, but I have one that they didn't have in very great expression. I want to consider the possibility that I might be wrong.
Oh, such modesty.
And that would be heresy because I cannot therefore learn from anybody else.
Yeah.
I do have all of the answers. It's just that you very mongrelized people don't come up with the right questions. And the answers right now don't fit those questions. So I got to ask new ones.
Disagreeable people.
And so what I have to say is, what happened to those malariologists who got eradicated?
Yeah.
What we have to say is, well, they were out there studying what kind of huts do these people live in. Well, they're like too far into the weeds. I don't want to talk about what diet these people have, what their income levels are, and where do they live, and why is the swamp next to them so close to... No. I want a vaccine for malaria so they can live right in the swamp. And they can... Well, those are the sorts of things that perpetuate the essential, meaning necessary, beneficiaries of my skill. You gotta have me there because it's necessary. I'm a ventilator. You gotta have it. It's necessary. Maybe not sufficient, but it's necessary at least.
There's going to be a lot of rusty ventilators around before we're done.
They'll be standing there with lots of toilet paper on them when the horde is all broken up.
Oh, dear.
So you were saying earlier you think people will be wearing masks until the fall, maybe even beyond the fall.
When we flatten the curve And that when you're outside in this great denominator of the atmosphere, you're probably going to get away with it walking down the sidewalk. You walk into a store, you walk into somebody's office, you walk into a classroom, they're going to be personal protection again, because what they were probably saying is something that we never quite know. You know, it can't hurt. Well, it can't hurt that you stay in isolation, you say. Now, wait a minute.
Yes, it does.
That's it. That's what death is.
Yeah, right.
And so, no, I'm never going to see you again. No, you can't put your snorkel out the window without having a filter on. All of these things are saying, what limits do you put on the sure thing certainty that this is going to be quantifiably a decrement in your risk? And the answer is, we don't know enough. So therefore, do all of this.
I tell you what we should do. Let's see if we can find some of those masks
Beaks.
with the ducks.
The beaks. I like the beaks because at least you would have pretty things to smell while you're contemplating the misery. I like the stick also because the stick is the single most measurable piece that we've got, which is 6 feet and don't come any closer. And how are you going to do that as an attending physician?
Hey, I've got my sword stick.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Every one of these, what is it that a doctor does? I see this in my medical student. You know, the person that comes to rent the TV service in the hospital, the usually undocumented woman who comes and mops the floor. The fact is, I'm saying that she's got a job and I want to support her and help and identify her. But she is not allowed to touch you. That, by definition, as an unwelcomed touching, is called assault and battery. Now, you come into the same room, you are not allowed not to touch. It is your obligation. And that means that you are not the superior of, you are not an observer of, you are a participant in this human condition and that which is afflicting this individual. And how can I relieve you of that burden in some way? Some of that burden comes from excising the pus, taking out the tumor, or doing something. There are some things that we're not that good at taking away from you. And so that touch at least conveys the common humanity and the concern. So now I come into the room and I am not allowed to breeze through there with my beak full of nosegays. I am supposed to stop and participate in this human condition. And I did a little study of my own once, just because medical student was tagging behind me with a spiral notepad, and they said, let's time these interviews. And white coat coming in, walking through, and I said, tell me, ma'am, have you had a bowel movement today? You know, the most fascinating conversation topics I'm sure you want with an intelligent patient is all about their bodily functions. And I'll spend 15 minutes. Okay, we walk out. The student is taking note of all my questions and also the time that we spent. We come to the next patient, and I walk over to the chair right next to the bed, and I sit down. And I reach out, and I make like I'm reading a pulse. This is like a Tibetan physician or something like that. I don't know the first thing about reading a pulse. All I know is I made contact. And is that a picture of your daughter? Boy, she's a pretty lad. She's about 6, is she? Actually, she's 4. She's a big, she's really. Okay, now, is there anything you'd like to ask of me or anything I'd like to do? And then I get up and walk out, and the student writes down 4.5 minutes. We come to the next one, and then the student goes back behind and he says, what did you think of Dr. G coming through today? Yeah, he just ran in here and ran out, just, that was the 15-minute guy. And a 4.5 minute, oh, that was wonderful. He helped me so much, and I did no thing. Now, you tell me what this high-touch, high-tech business is. So that today, everything is on its head. That you went into medicine in order to make a contact with a human and to learn something about your own problems from theirs and to do whatever you could to relieve some of their burden. Now, you show me that beak and the wide leather hat and the goggles and everything else like that. And then you show me the PPE in our ICU with no family member present. Family members are not invited to our ICU. It doesn't matter that this might be the last 30 minutes of this patient's life. And by the way, how do I pull out my cell phone and find out your phone number and get a video conference call when I now have to immerse this in some antiseptic, the same stuff that we're supposed to insufflate into our lungs? And how do I do all of that when I'm dressed in my PPE? The PPE has been the focus of everybody. And why? Because it's defensive. How do I keep the vermin from you from contaminating me? Well, that's a reasonable statement to make if you are isolated from humanity. Now, there's an awful story that came today, and I'll even give her the name. And this is a pretty young lady. She's 43 years old, and she worked in Manhattan, and she was the head of the ER up there. And she's on the front line, and she's doing all the triage of these COVID patients, and they're coming on in. And then she develops the disease. She turns positive. So she goes home, isolates for a couple of weeks, and now 3 weeks she wants to go back to work. They let her come back to work. So she's working for 3.5 days when she's really, I can't do that. And so they say, okay, why don't you take a break? And she goes home to her family in Charlottesville, Virginia, where her father, who's a physician, her name is Lorna Breen.
Mm-hmm.
She killed herself.
Oh, no.
And so what would you call that? I call that the direct mortality of COVID-19. And now remember, there's a lot of that that's going to be by interpretation, and I'll give you that interpretation. I've written a fair amount of death certificates, and you get cause of death. Here's the line right here. And then you get 1, 2, 3. There are only 3 lines, and these are contributing factors. So let's assume that someone's off the street, and I don't know very much about them, and I just got the following. I'll write down cardiac arrest, cause of death. Causative factor, chronic lung disease. Number 2, diabetes. Number 3, morbid obesity. So that's number 1, 2, and 3. So, I mean, most people, you can say, die when their heart stops, right?
Yeah,
I mean, this is
right,
what we got.
right.
Now, only when you've got a lot of people in a pattern, and a pattern comes on in, one after another, do you move those things up the line?
Mm-hmm.
You could probably write all the way down here, you know, alcoholism could slip from number 3 to number 1 if it turned out that the liver failure was a cause of death.
Good Lord, I didn't realize this.
And so what happens is that now I'm in Manhattan and I'm sitting there in an emergency room. Bloody everybody is going to come in and they're all going to have a number 1 line COVID-19. The fact that they might have had one of those other contributing comorbidities as their single biggest problem until this one knocked them off is a judgment call, right? So what would I say about this young lady, and is it her own hand?
Mm-hmm.
No, I would write COVID-19 caused her death.
This was a consequence of that.
And how many of these people are you going to see? Because again, when you now go back, those people in LA County in Los Angeles that are found in early February to have died, and only their archival material, taking it out of their pathology specimens, do you find out. So now, you said at that time they died of pulmonary failure, they probably had some interstitial pneumonia, causative agent unknown. Well, now we know the name of that causative agent. So as you look around, you're going to have to find a number of the social, cultural, economic reasons that contributed to that number 1 line. So in the Middle Ages, you could have said cause of death, smallpox. Number 1 and contributing factor would be semi-starvation and serfdom. Number 2 down the line, you could say the feudal system itself. And so now, at what point do you say communism? At what point do you say totalitarian dictatorship? I could write that on a whole lot of the death certificates I wrote when I was in Rwanda and in the gentle land of Laos, in spots where you didn't expect that.
Mhm.
And there are a number of these other things. So that's so obvious that, this person was brought in and chained up in the elementary school here in Kampuchea or Cambodia. Well, yeah, it's obvious. It's less obvious if they just don't ever get a living wage that suits them. All of these things that are that
boy, yeah.
human culture that created the niche for this agent. So once again, Osler, ask not, well, it's perfectly obvious they had COVID-19. Yeah, they did. But remember, a lot of those kids running around have COVID-19 too. And so why was it that the COVID-19 tipped the balance in this patient and not those many, many more? So our submarine part of the iceberg, remember we now have 1 million people in the US who are COVID-19 positive. We have 60,000, the day after tomorrow it'll be 60,000, that died. That comes to about 6%. Okay, so if that's the case, what distinguished them? Now, how many times, and I don't want to hear it again, we are all in this together. Well, let's differentiate those we's. And why are they seeming to cluster in a group of people that have this niche that was open before, nobody knew it and recognized it. And as soon as we get the magic vaccine, it goes away, we've eradicated it. Not really, because we're never going to eradicate coronavirus, so they're going to be suppressed. They're going to get another species in there later. It goes away, the niche is still open. And why is it that we now have monkeypox plague coming through the world, and it's affecting particularly Americans of a given class, a given race, a given economic state? All of these things are clustered in that group. Well, then why do you want a new vaccine? Because no matter how many vaccines you come up with, that group is still going to have a higher death rate. They are the people I was transplanting kidneys into. They are the people that don't thrive when they have an automobile accident because they don't have any reserves to back it up. All of these are questions that sound like a surgeon shouldn't be asking them.
Mm-hmm.
And since the surgeons aren't asking them, the politicians take credit for it. Thank you, I'll do that. I've got the cure, I've got this, and tomorrow you'll wake up and it's all a bad dream, it went away. I don't think so, because that single answer you have didn't address any of the questions unasked.
Oh, wow. God, I can see the conundrum.
So public health maintains itself very nicely because it's one of those background things. Public health to most people mean you've got a sewage system, you've got a water system, and you've got a factory that's supposed to have a control apparatus to keep the air from being breathed. That's all we need. And by the way, when they get to school, we have to check to see that you had your vaccinations. It doesn't mean how many people here are living below the poverty line. What do they look like? How is it that most of the obesity and hypertension is concentrated in that group, and why? What is it that we can do to induce health enhancing procedures? It's not perfect. I agree, it's not perfect. But it gets a great big multiplier because that is going to be less expensive, more effective, because primary prevention is always better. Secondary prevention means you got to have a big fancy hospital and tertiary care center. And the third order mitigation is only we need rehabilitation after you've already lost most of the functioning systems, and you got to have support systems. I was that guy because I did critical care. I did all of this at a time when nobody had any idea what was going on. It was a new plague that came through Washington, and people had this particular agent, and it was infecting the lungs, exactly the way coronavirus does. It doesn't fill the lungs and you cough it up. No, it's in the interstitial. And it was called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. It was a little protozoan organism. In fact, we used heavy metal, antimonials, the same stuff that I'm now using in Geelhoed in Africa. The last refuge of heavy metal therapy. Most of history has used mercury and lead and crazy things like that. Okay,
Yeah.
now I'm using antimony for Geelhoed called visceral leishmaniasis in Africa. At that time, we used it for this thing called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. We put them on a ventilator, and they got successfully worse. we can't ventilate the lungs anymore. Well, I was fresh. I had a lot of lab stuff going, and I knew exactly what to do about this. I'm a surgeon, right? So I cannulate the artery and vein and hook them to an extracorporeal membrane oxygenator, an artificial lung, if you will. And the reason we did this, not knowing it at the time, was that by taking over the work of the lung, you can oxygenate through the same thing they use for the open heart operation. When you stop the heart, they can oxygenate you through the lungs, and they can also take over from that corporeal membrane oxygenator called ECMO. So I've done a bunch of ECMO, and I've got several patients that came off the ECMO. Not all of them, maybe like 40% of them. And why? Because in the interval, we had a therapy directed at the primary problem. The pentamidine treated the no-assisted cardiac pneumonia. So as we went in, we put the lungs at rest. I used to say about this in ICUs and intensive care generally. Assume that you walk up these stairs and you trip and you fall and oops, my leg. I've got a right angle bend right here in the middle of my leg.
Right, okay.
Now what's the problem? And I'm going to say to you, well, I'll tell you what you want to do. Come here. I want you to do 20 deep knee bends. I want you to do 10 jumping jacks. And I want you to run in place for 5 minutes. And I'll come back and I'll look. And if your leg is at a right angle like that, you probably broke your leg. Now, you may not be happy with that orthopedic advice. Now, you come to the ICU with a pulmonary problem, and I ventilate your lungs to the highest volumes with the highest pressure and the highest oxygen tension. Every other part of medicine, you rest the injured part. Here you come in with a primary pulmonary problem, and I have to go full out and stress that injured part to the maximum. And of course they don't thrive.
Yeah, right.
Not only that, it's not just the lung. Now you get this particular phenomenon, and that's the white cells are all activated. The first start, I think I talked to you about this the other day, the first response to a new antigen is you get macroglobulin, these great big globulins, they're not very specific. Over time, it comes down to immunoglobulin, IgG, and that's what your long-term humoral immunity is all about. You got them calling in white cells, and the white cells come around and they give out these toxic, noxious things that are supposed to kill the virus. They're called cytokines, and the cytokine storm. It releases these enzymes and they start chewing up things. Oh, they're really great, they're working on the virus. Wait a minute, they don't have any brains. Those enzymes start working on the pulmonary membrane, they start working on the vasculature, they start working on the kidney.
They don't stop.
They don't stop. So now what happens is that, hey, shucks, now that I know you have cytokine storm, are there any things that we can do to decrease the inflammatory response? Wait a minute, isn't the inflammatory response the one that's making the antibody? So in essence, you can come in there with big doses of steroids or something like that, and that ought to be pretty good. Yeah, but then you get more virus and you get greater. So what do we know about this? And the answer is, we don't know anything about the treatment of coronavirus effective 2 months ago. Effective now, we know a little bit about it. What we don't know is how to treat it. And what we're doing is supporting the patient with the disease for such a length of time as perhaps their own immune response can take care of it because there isn't anything else. And we try to avoid the same thing that people have said in medicine forever, primum non nocere. We do not want to cause more damage. So hammering the lungs when the lungs are the ones affected is not smart. So we use the ECMO. Well, that's big time. We're now talking about not just a ventilator, we're talking about 20 people that might know how to use that. Yeah. In Washington, D.C., I was one of 2 when we did this. And we were working around the clock at 12-hour shifts, and we got a few people off, but that was because of the interval therapy. What's the interval therapy for COVID-19? Interval. I mean, we don't have any therapy. So all of these statements that have made that chloroquine is it, maybe it's an antibody. I tell you what, we'll use this special immunosuppressive. Yes, 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 and yes. Each of these things have now been put into quick trials, and steroids. We'll give them steroids to keep that. 1, 2, 3. Now an anti-cytokine therapy has been. The first early responses makes it worse. So each of these trials have been stopped, and the reason is it doesn't look like anything we're doing. Remember the story in the air. There's no immediate response you can make that can't make this problem worse. So don't jump and say, look, I heard from a friend that it could possibly be. You need some experience with the disease. And we're gathering that fairly fast. But there is no such thing as instant experience. Mm-hmm. And what is happening about most of the experience is there's less wisdom associated with it. Now that's my whole problem in going out in the developing world and trying to bring surgical treatment in remote areas. I've got a hammer. Everything is a nail. You are here as mission to operate. No, we don't do operations. We perform surgery. We have to determine whether there's a humanitarian benefit from this procedure. And we are not proceduralists. We don't line up 60 people and say, I don't know what your problem is, but you're all getting an operation because that's what I know how to do. Which is exactly what some of these parachute missions do. They come back and say, how was your mission? It was great. We did 72 cases. How'd they do? I don't know because we just did the operations. Well, what were the problems they had? Well, they all pretty much had the same problem. Well, of course they did because you didn't distinguish one from another. Is there something there that could have happened? So one of the things, and I'll give you, this is my hobby horse, and I'll say it in the way that I know how to say it. It sounds like I am a semantic pedantic.
Oh my God, those two big words.
I go absolutely bonkers if someone says to me, how many surgeries did you do today? First of all, surgery is a profession. It's not plural. You have just equated, you have identified surgery as a technique, a particular procedure that you understand. I didn't do many surgeries today. It's like you coming to me and asking me, how many pediatrics did you do today?
Yeah, right, okay.
Okay, but that's fundamentally an illiteracy. Let's talk about the real thing, and that is, you have equated the procedure with the profession. And now I then saw 15 patients this morning, and they were all sent to me because they want an operation, or someone else said they need an operation. Well, a couple of them actually have a problem that could have been fixed by surgery as a surgical profession with an applied procedure. I performed surgery. I said, wait a moment here. Look at what they've got going. They have heart failure, and they have not ever been put on digitalis, and they haven't. They have paralysis of their lower extremities from a transverse spinal problem. They have decubitus ulcers from bed sores because of that spinal paralysis. They have a urinary tract infection because they can't stand up to pee, and they're obstructed in their urinary tract. In that list, the hydrocele that you've identified is problem number 29. And if you address that one by an operation, it is not going to benefit them, it will kill them. Yeah. As a consequence, we're going to give this fellow digitalis, we're going to treat him for his urinary tract infection, we're going to try to address his wounds. We send them out, and they said, no surgery was performed. No, that was the apex. That was the highest part of surgery. It was judgment. It was looking at what benefit we could be to this individual. Now, I give you that because I rail against the people who want me to operate on lots of people. For example, I gave you one, which was I arrive and the radio announcement is an American professor of surgery is here to do 500 circumcisions free. You don't need an American professor of surgery. You don't need a surgeon. You don't need, but they didn't need operations, so let's come forward with an operation that we can have. So then I would have done 500 surgeries by their definition. And I said, no. If we do one, we will have to do it for an indication, and if we do that, I will have someone else do it for a maximum of 2, because after the second one, if they don't know how to do it, I'm not going to take that student through anything further. That's a failure of the student, not the procedure. So that's an analogy,
Yeah.
I will then say, how many vaccines have you done today and to what end? And the question would be, I get that with the ventilators. I look at the ventilator and I say, the ventilator is not a magic machine. It is an extension of a human skill with some care and concern, and has to be carefully judged as to who will benefit from it and what the outcome is coming on the other side. Analogy number 2, and this hits me hard. 20 patients are sent to the magic machine, send them to the truck. The truck is going to fix them. Well, wait a minute, the truck doesn't have any soul to it. It's not got any skill in it. Unless I'm standing there with it, there's no purpose in doing this, because after all, the machine is not magic in that it does it all by itself. What it has been is carefully selecting the individual, then performing the appropriate procedure, if procedure it is it's warranted, rather than medicine or no therapy at all. And then the follow-up of that. So assume this fellow has a bad hip. Are we going to replace the hip in the unit? Where is the inpatient hospital bed? Where is the rehabilitation? Where is the physical therapist?
Do you realize you're just blowing up right now? The whole system, how Medicare pays the professional?
Exactly, from the back to the front.
Yeah. That's crazy.
And so what we do is we spend most of Medicare funds in the last 3 weeks of life. What would happen if we took all of the Medicare, which is enormous, I mean, that's the same size as the military budget,
Yeah.
and we put that into the malariologist who should have studied how it is that we can
Oh, the
approach
preventative
the
medicine.
preventive.
Oh my goodness.
The preventive. Now, if we had done that, we would still have some people who need to have some procedures that we have to ask of them, is this going to be of value? So someone, is this American? Is this something that is just total blasphemy? Comes into the ICU with a pulse oximeter and it's measuring 40. They should be 90 or better. They come in 40 and then they have obesity and hypertension and they've had previous stroke and things like that. We have a ventilator right there. Well, are you going to tell me I'm holding that back, saving it for someone else that I might know or whatever? No, it's not a favor to that person to get put on that ventilator. And the reason for that is, I can tell you up front that there will not be any chance of bringing that patient on. But we can, therefore we must. So we intubate and we ventilate,
Oh, God,
and the
it's
patient
crazy.
does not survive this after a very large investment. So I give this to my students at all times, and I talked to you about this at one time when we were giving this generalized discussion about how it is that we learn out these in the perfect. One of the unusual tumors that happens a lot in the tropics, especially in Africa that I'm bringing through, but also in India and other places I've taken folks, is called a hepatoma. It's a tumor of the liver itself, highly associated with a viral disease long time before, hepatitis B. In fact, a Nobel Prize was won by a woman named Sheila Sherlock, Dame Sheila Sherlock now, since she was knighted. And she is the one who identified the Taiwanese Railway Union and looked at those who had had hepatitis and those who had been immunized against it and found a much higher tumor rate of the hepatoma. So put that in your future file because that's of an important subject. Now in comes this fellow, and he's got yellow eyes and he's got a mass. It doesn't hurt him very much. I just saw him. It was a week before I left Africa. And I brought in my surgical resident, not from my school, but from another. And I said, what do you think? And she, I don't know, we need to have a CAT scan. And I went, okay, let's start with electricity. We don't need that because I can feel it, right?
Yeah.
I can feel it with my fingers, and so your fingers are giving much more information than the CT scan will right now, because you know immediately that the problem that he has that's making his eyes yellow is coming from the liver. The liver has this great big thing in it, and it's very big indeed. In fact, it's involving all the lobes of the liver, and it's solid, but it doesn't hurt him much. He's got a little itching, which comes along with the jaundice. And what are we going to do for this? Well, what would we do at your institution? Yeah, well, we would get an angiogram CAT scan, then probably an MRI, and then we would try to embolize through the catheter, and then we would radiate, and then we would go to the operating room, and we would do a tri-segmentectomy. That means taking out all 3 segments of the liver, trying to have 20% remain. The reason for the 20% is that this is magic. It really is magic this time. And that is, if you take out 10, 15, 20, 60, 70% of the liver, the other piece regenerates back to 100%.
Oh, good.
Here's a big question I have. Why 100%? Why not 300%? I mean, what stops it from keeping it? But that's an interesting question for later. If you take out all but 20%, the liver regenerates. If you take out 90%, the patient goes into hepatic failure and dies. So there's a limit to that reserve. I just gave it to you. 90% no, 80% yes. So we do a tri-segmentectomy. That's a big operation. It takes some skills that not too many people have, and it's usually one in a tertiary center, and it'll probably take 13 to 15 units of blood, and it'll take a period of time in the intensive care that probably is going to be about 2 weeks. It'll be separated from family. They can come and see him probably on a TV screen. And then what? Well, he'll die because we don't have a treatment for that disease. Well, wait a minute, you just said you do angiography and CT scan, but yeah, there's no treatment for the disease. Well, you just applied all these treatments. Why? Pourquoi? I mean, is there a reason
right,
for
doesn't
this?
make sense. Right.
So, well, we can, and we must, because we can, and so therefore we do all of this. Who knows, you know? Okay, so now what are we going to do about this patient? Well, you know, he's here, so I guess you get a helicopter and bring him someplace like where you are. Well, out of the question. There is no helicopter and there is no tertiary care center. So we're going to give him 8 tablets. Here's my 8 tablets, and they're pretty good. And I talked to the family, one of them particularly, and that is usually a son or a wife or whoever it is that can understand this through translation or otherwise. And I say, he's going to go home with you now. And as he's home with you, I want you to take care of him and feed him as normal and everything else like that. But when he has really bad pain, you give him 2 of these pills. And when he has pain that is so bad he can't stand it, give him the other 6. This is called compression of morbidity. He didn't spend his time in the ICU. He didn't spend $180,000 of human resources, the intensive care nursing staff and the blood and all the procedures. And the outcome was the same, but it was at home. Now, the difference is that one of these is humane and compassionate care, and the other is a technologic, here it is, triumph of technique over judgment.
Oh my God, yeah, okay.
And that means we can, therefore we must.
Mm-hmm.
Well, hold on. This is not mindful. This is not in any way designed for his benefit so much as a tour de force of your expertise, which you've just told me is ineffective. So it's necessary, but insufficient. Well, since we know that up front, what is necessary? So what would a good day look for? How would it be if you're in that bed?
Yeah.
Well, no way. You're never going to get me on a ventilator. No way. I've seen that. Oh, okay. Now, what about him? So that I say that every time we're in an operating environment, like my mobile surgical unit, 2 operating beds. Who's the most important person here? Surgeon, captain of the ship. I'm in charge here. I own these things. I bought them. Bloody hell, it's me. The anesthesiologist. I'm the guy who's trying to keep them alive. The nurse, circulating nurse. I'm the one who's the keeper of the gate. It's the one lying down. And unless and until you understand that, you ought to be absent. And if you're not, I'll help you in absenting you.
Yeah.
Because if you're saying, no, it's me, it'll me. See, I want to do this operation. Well, you wanting to do the operation is not the indication for its performance. So we've had a lot of that, and my problem is often, I've come to operate. Well, let's start with, we have a population here who's in an unusual set of circumstances, and they have particular problems in which this one may be riding as a super overrider, and we have to ask, what can we do in this environment? Well, if I were back home, yeah, but we're not. So unless you want to carry him back home and carry it out there, well, I can't. Well, then what are we going to do here? What's appropriate? So the appropriate application of technology. Now, you didn't hear me say I'm triaging these people. You didn't hear me say, unless you vote the straight Republican ticket, or unless you ascribe to Allah, or unless you do. I've said none of that. I've said, what is the benefit in this patient's terms to this patient? And we have to ask that all the time. And one of the big problems is that when we come with a bunch of fancy technology, they see this big pair of white vans. These are huge white trucks. They must do everything. They can do everything. Therefore, you must, because we want to learn something about how to
Regardless
do
of
that
the
together.
consequence. Yeah.
And the consequences are, we've got these patients all lined up. And I don't say this out loud because no one should, because I've done a lot of experiments with white rats. These are not
White rats.
neither white nor rats. And the fact is, we are not going to treat them as such. And so this is not an experiment on application of my skill. This is, what is this patient's problem, and can I contribute in any way to relieving him of that? So that burden is different.
God, that you know, the word ethics is a gray area.
Well, ethics also, and you've heard about situational ethics, it may be one thing different in a different environment. And I'm not saying, as someone says, there's a different standard of care. No, there's about one standard of care worldwide. What would I want, or an immediate member of my family, want to have done in this set of circumstances? Well, as she said, you got to bring this patient out of here, come to my institution, and then we would do this. But we can't. So what would you want if you are not able to come out of this totally foreign place? He doesn't speak the language, doesn't have the funds, he doesn't have anything that make it come. So what can we do in his own environment to make this better for him? Because I live in that environment. You know, I'm not frightened, as most of my participants are, by being there, because I recognize these people are not at all like us. They are us.
How true. Well, with that, can we take a pee break?
I think that'd be a wonderful idea. That is preventative medicine.
When you gotta go, you gotta go. I'm sorry.
Not at all. Have at it.
Okay.
So in 6 months, do you think everybody's going to be wearing a mask? And because it seems like right now everybody wants to go back to work.
Yeah.
They're tired of being at home. And you see many states, they're opening up because people just aren't going to take it anymore.
Yeah, they'll be out and about in the public places, but once they get into confined spots, they're going to be wearing masks.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is some by regulation and some by a store will say, you can't come in here without a mask.
Right. So the key is being in confined spaces with other people.
Yeah, what you're talking about is what is the volume in which this could be diluted if you are positive.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm running on the trails right now without a mask.
Right.
But I'm not embracing people along the way.
No. And people are avoiding, I know, just biking on the trails, as soon as I get close to somebody, they're standing 10 feet away.
They don't understand the inverse square law. And that is, you would have to be pretty close to absorb very much, or even the probability of something. All in all, that too is arbitrary, because, you know, 6 feet, all right, why not 60 feet?
Right.
And if the wind current was right, you could prove that that's not safe. So
Right, because it's a question of dosage and you know, exposure.
no one's got
There's no, you can't. Yes, Andrew sent me an email. He said, you know, if the coronavirus is big balloons in the air and you could see them, you could dodge them. But the trouble is, you can't see them. You don't know where they are. It's just.
And in fact, that's one of the things that people are trying to do, is to separate themselves you know, these spherical bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
People have been going outside in this spherical bubble that you can walk around in, which I think is for humor's sake, because there's no way that is a practical application.
What do you think about Sweden? You know, doing the herd, basically looking for herd immunity. I think Netherlands is doing the same too.
Well, the two of them are small and very, very highly socialized states. They are the single two examples that anyone would come up with about a socialism that's fairly paternalistic for both of those populations. And I think that given their incidence, as is known now, because Sweden is ahead of us in testing, that they have figured that the rate of new infection from breaking down isolation is going to be lesser than the disruption in their total overall well-being, economy being the first of those. And that's fair to say that. And they can say it because they're socialized.
Right.
This rugged individualism in the US is saying nothing. You can't place a value on life. We do it all the time. That's what actuarials are all about. You can't place a value on life, so everything has to be perfect before I'm back. Well, that'll not happen. So when do we stop this absolutism that you'd like to refer to? Remember that we do this, for example, in the FDA, we have this the rule that you can't have anything in the food stock that is carcinogenic to rats or to experimental animals or whatever. And if it's proven there in the rat to be carcinogenic, you can't be putting it. Well, the rat, of course, is getting a 100,000-fold dose in order to see whether this is carcinogenic or not. Now you can find out the human, which is not the same scale as the rat, and the environmental component of that is so much lesser. Okay, let's do a sliding scale and get a dose response curve. And so we allow a certain number of parts per million, don't we? Mercury or lead or anything else like that. We don't say zero because you know you can't achieve that. So you give it some number below which there are no data. It becomes like astrology when you're comparing numbers that are terabyte giga. When you get something that's a known risk of something that has a potential for prevention, treatment, or mitigation, that you can get skin cancer from a certain radiation. Well, is skin cancer going to kill you? Not very likely. Is there something you can do to mitigate it? Yes, you can put it. Is there something you can do to rehab afterwards? Yes, we can excise that skin and put a graft on it. That's going to be a lesser requirement to have that out of the environment. I mean, little kids from that point forward are running around on a beach, and they're not doing it with PPEs,
Right.
full body covers, because we know that, yeah, there's a risk to doing that. Where's the only place on planet Earth where a Celtic people live on the equator or near it? That's Australia, Queensland. What's the melanoma capital of the world? Bingo.
Yeah.
So what you say is, well, we know that, and we recognize it as a risk that within a finite time, you can't tell a teenager not to lie out in the sun because they haven't had any of their friends die of melanoma.
Right.
It comes on at 20, 40, 50, 60 years later, and so you could tell them at public health, limit your sun exposure and use some sort of skin protective device.
But it seems like the U.S. is going through a lot of effort to flatten the curve, which is just going to extend. Basically, you flatten it and you're going to prolong things. Whereas in Sweden, they've decided to accelerate everything.
They started from a different point.
And
I think
trying
it's
to go
260 deaths in Sweden as opposed to 60,000 here,
Right.
and we have 1 million cases of positivity.
What do they have, a population of 11 million?
They have about the same size as New York City. So,
Right. So they're just taking an educated gamble.
They are, and they're saying that they have a better health system for the lowest pieces of that, the entry into that, without a barrier to entry.
Right.
Right now you have to be insured to be in New York or
Right.
come to a hospital that's a charitable one. And in Sweden you don't have that problem. So they're saying that given the mitigation pieces are in place, we consider our risk to be lower than yours, because we look at your comorbidities and say that they're much higher than ours. We have some Swedish obesity, but not coupled with the inactivity and hypertension, all the other things that you have. So because of the healthcare system, they have been addressing those comorbid factors longer than we. So we have untreated comorbidities, and then all your coronavirus is free.
Mm.
And they have said, let's work on a niche. And
Mhm.
so I would agree with their approach. I don't know where the numbers allow you to.
Well, that's what everybody's going to be watching, you know, in the months ahead to see how it worked out.
That's why you got an experiment going on right now. It's
Right.
called New Zealand against Australia. Australia is locked down, New Zealand is opening up, and they're the same people, same place.
So you're going to see different results and different
We'll find out.
philosophies.
I mean, we don't know. That's the assumption.
But the question, I guess it's a question of how they deal with it in the future.
Yeah.
Because there's going to be COVID-19 today and something else tomorrow.
See that I have been involved in, not very involved, but no one's been very involved in a couple of upstart problems that have come from big antigen ships, not drips. And I've been involved in a couple of things that were never known because they killed people so quickly that no one got any viable tissue to take that back. That's a pretty steep curve, and it collapsed instantly. You don't have any host to carry it on when you have no living carriers.
Yeah, everybody dies right away.
And boom, it's gone. So that's why it has to come through you through a vector.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing about bubonic plague that made it awful is that when it came, it was in the sylvatic cycle. I remember being in Mongolia and working my way through what was called Outer Mongolia at the time, now called Zavkhan province. They really liked their marmots. The marmot was precious to them, and you got a marmot as a special dinner on your wedding or on your the mayor's birthday or something like that. But they were kind of being pressured for that reason, so they made them illegal to capture. That didn't mean that the mayor still had his marmot. We were served a marmot because of it. But they had the flea, Xenopsilla cheops, and that is where the sylvatic endemia was. And so it was pretty good then, and they lived and kept along pretty happily. Now the Mongols came, and they brought their sylvatic cycle into the rats of Europe. And so Rattus norvegicus, the ship rat, the one that went to Genoa. In fact, the European entry came from the Middle East, from Turkey, because as the Mongols came on down to Turkey, it went up to a single port and a single entry in Genoa. And that meant that it went up through Europe fairly quickly, and it still had to infect the rats. So that the people who had the smallpox had to live in fairly intimate association with the rats, which they did, of course, because at the lower end of the scale, in this feudal scale, they were everywhere. So what happened is that you had to have, in this cycle, you have the flea, you have the rat, and you have the human, and all the other humans over here that weren't living in intimate association with the rats were immune to all of that. And so this was the cycle. The rats died. It was called a rat fall because the problem is called a blocked flea. When the flea takes a blood meal, the blood coagulates and they can't absorb it from the gut. So I have these microscopic pictures of rats with a big clot in their gut because they can't absorb it. So what happened then is that the flea is hungry. He's starving. And he jumped ship from the rat to the human. In jumping ship to the human, he now allows that cycle to be complete. That is not a big hazard because you can do rat control, right? You don't have to do much rat control because the rats are dying on their own. That's why you got the Pied Piper and
Right.
Now the problem with smallpox is that it's a bacillus. It's an organism that is from a bacillus that Alexander Yersin identified in Russia, so it's called Yersinia pestis. And when you are getting it, it's affecting the lungs. Now you can cough it up. And in coughing it up, this really is not aerosolized, but airborne. Now you're not talking about tiny little things, you're talking about a bacillus coming on out, like me coughing out pneumonia organisms or something like that. Now here's something, and it's got a nice name to it, so you recognize it immediately. Now you've got this person, me, with coughing out Yersinia pestis, and Fred sitting here. I have human to human transmission without a rat or flea anywhere seen. Thank you. No rat, no flea necessary. This is pneumonic bubonic. Now it can go right through any particular household, any particular village, especially if you have a crowded group that are all hovering inside the city walls in the serfdom, that the people are out in the fields working, and then come in the night over the drawbridge into the medieval village. Pneumonic bubonic meant that these people with their hoity-toity ways, and the physicians with their beak, and the princes with their retreats in the mountains would go there not knowing that they didn't have to be in association with the unclean, the vermin-infested people, because the first person that had the plague could give a pneumonic bubonic transmission. So that was a bit of a disappointment to them, knowing that their wealth or their power did not protect them.
Yeah, I was just, thinking as you were talking, if you flatten the curve and it extends out for a long period of time, don't you end up in the same place as a place like Netherlands or Sweden?
Well, the problem that you may be overcoming is that in that time, you're going to encounter a lot of people who are getting the COVID-19 exposure, who then develop some degree of immunity. We don't know how much, because we don't know what the marker, we don't know how effective the antibody is. But at least the little children are running around and don't seem to be sick.
Right.
So what's happening is that we assume that there's some protective benefit to this antibody marker. And so over a prolonged period of time, you're going to have a big bunch of childlike immune herd immunity. So that now this person, me, COVID positive, cough, spill, do whatever, and it encounters the next 20 people, all of whom have no susceptibility to it. So eventually I will be extinguished. I will be either asymptomatic or dead.
Right.
And over that time, I will have accommodated. In essence, in one individual, you will have relived the history of parasitism. The parasite kills its host. That's not a very good strategy. So you have an adaptive mechanism whereby that host and the parasite come to a, if not symbiotic, at least commensal. They live together. They cohabit without having a lot of troubles. We have a lot of that. I mean, the whole intestinal flora probably were invaders that set up shop and gave benefit to the host, and therefore became the kind of benefit that you would get rather than a hazard.
Right.
Now, the long haul is what we don't have. When we talk about a flattened curve, remember this stuff started this year, in the last month of 2019, so that we've only got 3 or 4 months. So we're talking about a long view and flattening that curve. We can't predict what's going to be out there because we couldn't predict how it started. We didn't have any idea about its virulence. We still have very little idea about its pathogenesis, meaning it gets into lots of tissues and causes you chills and fever and gives you aches and stuff like that. But our biggest problem seems to be that it gets into the interstitium of the lungs. And there it causes a gap between the blood and the air interface, and that means that you can't oxygenate blood. Now, why does it probably doesn't pick that tissue preferentially. It's just that's where it's symptomatic to the point of death. So it would be, let's say this organism mutates to cause only kidney failure.
Right.
Well, now we're going to have a problem. We're going to throw away all those ventilators or recycle them as dialysis machines.
Right.
And that's what happens to various things over time, is that they may change the pathogenesis, or the host may change. We may all become little kids. And that's because those who are highly susceptible, meaning those that had all these comorbidities, no longer live.
Well, I have a comment. I've run the costs of delaying lifting all the regulations, and I'll tell you this much: if we go to August 1, we will not have a world to come back to.
Will be India.
Well, we'll be some kind of a place, but it won't be what we want.
Well, remember I said that right now, India's mortality from,
Well, I'm thinking of economics.
yeah,
purely.
right, I'm talking about the same thing.
Okay.
India, COVID mortality is exceeded by COVID starvation.
Okay.
So the economic impact in India is higher already than is the medical one.
Well, the indicators are really scary right now, what's going on here. Never mind in India. You realize one of the key ingredients for our cropping is fertilizer? Something so mundane no one even thinks about.
Mm-hmm.
The fertilizer market is just dropping through the floor.
What happened to oil? I mean, isn't that where the fertilizer
Yeah.
comes from?
Right. And so, I mean, you can say, look, we're going to take one hell of a hit on our production. And all these people are saying, oh, we've got lots of food. They're dreaming. We do not have lots of food.
And the lots of food we have can't make it anywhere.
And we don't have any reserves.
There's no market to it because
Yeah, but even the United States has very few reserves. We got rid of them all.
well, you can't necessarily bank fresh produce.
Yeah, but even the I'm thinking here, produce is always washed out right away because you can't keep it.
Right.
But the ideal is wheat, followed by barley, corn, oats,
You have 18
in other
months
words,
to go.
and rice, last of all. Because the softer you get, the more vulnerable they are to insects. And that's really the whole problem. But I'll tell you this much, we better come back pretty quickly because otherwise we're going to be in deep, deep trouble.
Be eating corn.
Far more, so it's not a factor anymore. It's got to be, we got to go back to normal.
Well, to the normal that we knew, because that's going to change too.
So,
I mean, the redundancy that we have in the U.S. is clearly unsustainable anywhere, including the U.S.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, if we ever did a cost curve, it would be on, number of deaths versus the cost.
Yep.
And the cost is rocketing even higher than the deaths. And that's my chart. So that's something else we have to think about, is that no matter what, the whole thing has to come to a stop anyway.
Well, look at the differential we just gave you. Who won the U.S. independence? Anopheles did. And that is because how many people got shot with round balls from a brown bess musket? Probably about 1/4 of the number that died of malaria. And so, again, there's a book by a fellow who is from Michigan, and I knew him when I was young, and that's why it's one of the first books I ever read on this subject. His name was Hans Zinzer, and he wrote a book called Rats, Lice, and History. And he pointed out that most of the major changes that have happened in human history, powers that might be, Napoleonic or otherwise, don't hold a candle to the microbe.
Yeah.
And that almost all of these that are given credit for having conquered this or that had a great deal of alliance from something microscopic.
Mm-hmm.
Civil War. I mean, the North won by attrition. And the reason for that was that the number of casualties was, I think, 1/4 the number of deaths by disease.
What?
Diarrhea. And that included typhoid and other things like that. So you know that if you got shot in the arm with a mini ball, you're probably going to die because sepsis and all the things that followed from it. However, those people who were in camps invariably were, especially because they didn't have much of a supply line, they were not very stable nutritionally, and so all of those diarrheal diseases and respiratory diseases, the war was a war of microbes. It wasn't until beyond the Korean War, it was the Vietnam conflict, where for the first time the death rate from casualties exceeded that from disease.
Good Lord. I did not realize that.
And that is always the case, of course. You could say ultimately those people who got shot and stayed in the ICU and died of sepsis, you might fudge that and say they're microbial deaths also. But at least they had an antecedent. So the gunshot wound up here in line 1, that caused death. And line 2 was endotoxic shock. Number 3 from intra-abdominal abscess. Number 4 from. So what that means is, we've moved up and up and up, depending on the incidence. How many of these do you see? So most casualties in all wars have come from microbial disease as opposed to direct hostility. And always the case is the dislocated people. They are always in a starvation mode. They are the ones that are tightly bunched in refugee camps and they die like flies. The interesting term that was invented in South Africa, the term becoming a very proper one, was concentration camp.
Oh yeah.
And that was a weapon of the British against the Boer. And the Boer were very successful because they were quite adaptive. And the British, with the entire Commonwealth, at the time Empire, to draw from, had 500,000 men in arms. And the Boer at maximum had 11,000 at the peak, total of 14,000 when they were, when you added in all the incapacitated people. And it was the Brits who sued for peace at Vlaardingen. But the reason for that was, in order to bring them to their knees, the Boer, who were not going to be outfought in their homeland, were there for several generations already and quite adapted, buckled when the British imprisoned the women and children in concentration camps. And if that didn't do it, they helped a little bit by giving them blankets like the American Indians got. And so tuberculosis and typhoid and things like that were huge. They were greater number of casualties for the Boer than was hostility. So concentration camp was a German warfare. Now we can complain about that because we identify it with the Germans, but it was invented earlier. And those are dependents that died in concentration camps.
I've never seen that in the history books.
Oh yeah, that's a phenomenon whereby you could see 3 generations of Boer, grandfather and grandson.
Hate them.
And they were not very happy about the Brits because their whole families were rounded up, and then 1 or 2 would sicken and die, and they would have a bit of a contagion going. And if it didn't happen soon enough, they gave up. In Orange Free State, as it was once called Orange Free State, now called Free State, there's a museum of the atrocities on each side, but that's the one that counted most, the greatest number of
God, that
deaths.
sounds horrible. Oh my God.
And there was that was what caused the rebellion. There were a couple of people who were quite prominent in this, and that was the souring of the British Empire, that particular phenomenon, the concentration camp. And there was one woman particularly who made her name by going in and out of those camps and trying to recognize and bring to the attention of the British people. And she was the earlier of the Florence Nightingales who called attention to this, and that really probably caused the British to sue for peace. After 35 of their generals went down there to, oh come on, these are just a bunch of dumb farmers, we can kick those off in a week. After 35 of them were defrocked, relieved of command, it was the concentration camp that did them in.
It's like my aunt's description of World War I when she was sent to the Irish Dames of Ypres, a convent, and her nursing career started there. And at any rate, she ended up there right at the beginning of the war, because they said, "Oh my God, you're from there," and so they sent her back there. So at any rate, she described, the treatment, and it just was absolutely horrendous of the opposing armies. They sent them to special tents, just totally ignored. Let's get rid of them, they're just a problem anyway. So there's some atrocities I've never written about them.
There are several towering figures, women, who are widely recognized. One I just mentioned, the other is Edith Cavell, who was nursing. And
Oh yeah, Mount Edith Cavell, right?
yeah, and she treated both sides, and she was executed for that reason. But the mountain there, I climbed her mountain and saw her glacier, an ancient
Did you?
glacier on the side of it. Yeah. In Canada.
Well, I think there might be a little dinner waiting for us upstairs.
Oh goodness, we're having our dessert now after a long course.
What time is it?